Then I suggest that we start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you can, it would be nice if you could switch on your camera so that I can see you. If not, well, then so be it. Hi, Denise. So let's start with our last class for this year. And that class will be on Japanese and the structural and the Transeurasian structural type. So you see a picture of Tokyo Tower here. And so this is our schedule for 2020. So as I said, the last course today on Japanese and the structural type. It follows after the introduction to the debate on the origins of Japanese. Then we did the different languages under discussion: Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic languages. We had a methodological course on how to establish language relatedness. And last time we came up with a comparative evidence, the similarities between Japanese and the other Transeurasian languages, but those were most situated within the lexicon, so individual words, the phonology, the sounds, and the morphology, the building stones of words and sentences. Today we will turn to language structure, that is abstract yes no features about language. So it's not like with words where you have a form and a function, or with morphemes too, you have a form, a function, and a third dimension, which is the paradigmatic position. But here we will merely discuss features, abstract features, where you can answer yes or no. So in the next courses, then after New Year, we will have a guest lecture by Mark Hudson and Ning Chao on the peopling of Japan. And then in our final course, we will bring everything together on the Japanese past, language, culture, and genes. And then we will have 4 days with student presentations, explicitly ask questions about the reading, because last time's lecture went in parallel with this reading. So basically what I presented was more or less the content of the article. And now we can do some recap questions, which are both on the article and last week's presentation. So first of all, a basic vocabulary list. What does it include? It consists of words such as a, mama, papa, crow, cuckoo, etc. Or b, words like spade, who, loom, pot, or words like see, eat, old, water, eye. I think that most people have seen that correctly. Indeed, basic vocabulary is words that occur universally across the languages of the world, and that express basic concepts such as eat and drink and old and new and so on. B is more cultural concepts, and A are nursery terms. The main strength of using basic vocabulary in historical comparative linguistics lies in the fact that, and then words with basic meaning tend to resist borrowing more successfully than random lexical items. B, sound correspondences hold only for the basic vocabulary. Or C, it is more convenient to study a small selection of the vocabulary. And again, most people have the right, or all people have the right answer, although one person did not answer. Indeed, it's A. So basic vocabulary items are relatively prone to borrowing. And then the following is not a basic vocabulary list. Most people have that right. Matthijs List is the name of the person who has his collexification database. The other lists are a real list. The Leipzig Jakarta list is the latest basic vocabulary list, which was developed in Leipzig at Max Planck Institute about 10 years ago. And the Swedish list is the traditional basic vocabulary list from 1955. And then one of the first scholars that used the argument that the Trans-Eurasian languages have no basic vocabulary in common against Trans-Eurasian affiliation is that Gustav Ramstedt, or B. Abel Remusa, or C. Gerhard Dürfer. Here the answers are a bit more diverse, but Gustav Ramstedt was not the right answer because he's really one of the pioneers of Trans-Eurasian studies. So he argued for Trans-Eurasian affiliation and not against it. Abel Remusat, however, is the correct answer. He was a sinologist, a French sinologist at the beginning of the 19th century, who already found that the Trans-Eurasian languages looked as if they borrowed from each other but did not really share a basic vocabulary, thus probably no inheritance. And Gerrit Dürfer was also a fervent opponent of Trans-Eurasian affiliation, but he lived a century later than Abel Remusa. I met him in Bochum, but now he died. And then the following word does not fit into the reconstruction of Proto-Trans-Eurasian duck to burn. Here too, the answers are a bit diverse. The first answer, A, is the correct one. However, Japanese taka means high. It does not mean to burn. It's semantically very divergent, so it does not fit. Even if the form would fit the etymology, the meaning doesn't. Yonaguni Dagun, to burn, is indeed a bit strange from the formal point of view. That is, the Japanese T was revoiced into a D and the K was voiced into a G, but still it is a valid cognate. It corresponds regularly to Japanese. And also Korean te, with the meaning of to make fire heat, corresponds regularly. And this is also the case for Turkish yak, as in Turkish, the correspondence to a D in Trans-Eurasian is a lenited glide y. And then collexification. What is collexification? Is it an instance where two or more meanings are expressed by the same lexical item, a kind of polysemy? Is it two or more words have identical words but different meanings, kind of homonymy? And then, or is it two or more words with the same meaning, like a synonymy? And here, most people have the right answer, namely A. a colexification is really something like polysemy, or one word with several meanings, and it's not one of the other options. And here the following meaning should not be compared to the meaning hard, solid, dry, difficult, or heavy. Uh, and here most people say heavy, which is the right answer. We said that so according to the database of colexification, we see that hard in several languages across the world is colexified with difficult. So that means that the same word has the meaning hard and difficult, which means that the semantic development has taken place and is thus legitimate to posit as a semantic development across the languages of the world. And this is true for all the semantic developments between the green parts uh, of this cluster. However, heavy is not at the end of one of the green points. Heavy is here, so that means that it would not be legitimate to compare hard with heavy. So that is just one way to control for semantic latitude. And which statement is the most sensible according to you? Is it A, that Japanese has no morphology in common with the other Transeurasian languages? B, Japanese has no paradigmatic morphology in common with the other Transeurasian languages? Or C, Japanese and the Transeurasian languages have less morphology in common than the Indo-European languages? Here we have eight people. All the people who answered gave the correct answer. Indeed, that's the most sensible thing to say. I agree that Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian languages do have morphology in common, but it is certainly not as rigid and as rigorous as that shared by the Indo-European languages. Which borrowing hierarchy is correct according to you? Are nouns borrowed more easily than verbs, and verbs more easily than grammatical items? Or are verbs borrowed more easily than nouns than grammatical items? Or is it very easy to borrow grammatical items and a bit less easy for verbs and difficult for nouns? Here, all people have the correct answer, namely, indeed, the borrowing hierarchy goes from nouns to verbs to grammatical items. So, this brings us to today's topic, Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian structural type. In this class, we will examine similarities between. When we speak of structural similarities, we speak of four different levels of language structure. So there's phonological structure, sound structure, and then we will discuss lexical and semantic structure, the structure of words and their meanings. We will discuss morphological structure, how the building stones of the words structure, and then syntactic structure or sentence structure. You probably saw the reading the reading for today's class. Maybe you can vote A. Wait, I try to maybe A and when you read it, and B when you did not read it. I will start a poll. I, I see that most people read it. One didn't, and then Ramon, I think you don't remember whether you read it or not, but that's fine. So the typological heritage is also a bit the topic of today's talk. So I will not ask many specific questions about the readings, but we will just present the slides for today. In this reading, I included one more level of language structure. Um, Nadine, maybe, do you know, Nadine Almeida, do you know which uh, level of language structure was included in the paper, which I did not mention here? One more than phonological, lexicosemantic, morphological, or syntactic structure, an extra level. Which level was that?
I'm sorry, I didn't read the text.
I'm sorry. Do that on purpose. I now see that you have a big answer. I'm sorry. Then Daniela Seibert, do you know that?
The grammaticalization patterns.
Yes, exactly. So the grammatical development. So it looks as if there's not only uh, similarities in the different levels of language structure, but there's also a similarity on in how certain categories develop. I left it out here because it goes a bit too deep in the complexities. But uh, you can read, if you are interested. You can of course read the points in the article or in the chapter. As we cannot give examples of all Transeurasian languages because that would lead us too far, that would lead us into, say, 95 different Transeurasian varieties, I have selected the contemporary Transeurasian languages from the 5 different branches. So I selected contemporary Turkish here, which belongs to the Turkic branch, as you know. Then I selected Khalkha Mongolic, the Mongolic branch. I selected Evenki, a Northern Tungusic language, Korean, the only existing Koreanic language, and then Japanese, the standard Japonic language. And in addition to these contemporary languages, I also had a look at historical Transeurasian varieties that we already discussed, like Old Turkic, the language spoken from the 8th century onwards in Mongolia's Orkhon Valley, Middle Mongolian, the language of Genghis Khan in the 13th and 17th century, and then Manchu, the language of the Qing dynasty in China from the 17th century onwards, and then the Middle Korean, the language of the proclamation of the Hunmin Chongom in the 15th century, and then Old Japanese, the language of the literary monuments of Japanese, like the Manyoshu in the 8th century. So these languages are well known ancient varieties. They are sufficiently known to have access to the grammar and the morphology and the lexicon. But apart from these Transeurasian languages, I decided to also select a number of neighboring languages, such as neighboring languages to the north, like Eastern Khanty, which is a Uralic language, Ket, which is a language isolate belonging to the Yeniseian family, Then Kolma Yukagir, which is a Yukagiric language, often claimed to be related to the Uralic languages. And then languages to the east, like Nif, which is also a language isolate, an Amuric language, Ainu, an isolate, an Ainuic language. And then to the southeast, Rukai, which is one of the Austronesian languages spoken on Taiwan. And then Mandarin Chinese, a Sino-Tibetan language. The reason why I also need neighboring languages is because I want to delimit the Transeurasian features. That is, I want to see whether there are features that are similar across all branches of Transeurasian, but not similar, dissimilar from the other surrounding languages in the area. So let's have a look first at phonological structure. And the first feature that we discuss is the presence of tongue root vowel harmony. Vowel harmony is very often the first feature that comes to mind when people speak about the Trans-Eurasian languages. Also, historically, it is one of the features that caught the eye very early. Already in the 19th century, people were pointing to features such as vowel harmony, uniting these Trans-Eurasian languages. It is indeed a striking feature whereby suffix vowels agree with root vowels. So, an example of vowel harmony is here illustrated by the Turkish suffixes. The suffix lar or ler expresses plurality, plural in Turkish, and we see that they choose an ler with a front vowel if the root of the word is also front, like here in ipler. Ip, an I, is a front vowel, so therefore the suffix vowel is not a but e, which is a front vowel, and you get ipler for ropes. Similarly, with another suffix, the de, which is the locative suffix in Turkish, you get, for instance, Türkiye de, because Türkiye has all front vowels. The suffix vowel is also front in Turkey. In contrast, other suffixes take a back vowel, so the ler becomes a lar with a back a. In roots that have a back vowel, like pul has a back vowel, you get pullar for stamps. And Almania, Germany, has all as, which is back, therefore the de also changes into da, and you get Germany da. So this is vowel harmony. The opposition in Turkish and the other Turkic languages is front back. That means that the e vowels belong to the front vowels and the a vowels belong to the back vowels. However, in other Trans-Eurasian languages, where there's also vowel harmony, there's a different kind of vowel harmony. Namely, the vowel harmony that has been proposed for most of the Trans-Eurasian languages follows a distinction between retracted and non-retracted vowels. So retracted vowels are vowels where that are pronounced with the tongue root to the back, and non-retracted uh, where the tongue root is not in the back of the mouth. So you have, for instance, in Korean, especially in Middle Korean, it is clear that the distinction is between retracted and non-retracted. You have an o, a that are retracted vowels, and then you have the u, the the u, and the o that are more in the front of the mouth and non-retracted. And here you see that verbs like to burn, that is sol in Korean, get a converb in a. He burned ants is solla, while verbs with a non-retracted vowel like in Korean, sul, get a o, suro. disappear. And in the same also for other forms, for instance here, not the converb but a nominal form, you also get with the same verb seron with an O, while with the other verb for disappear, it would be serun, disappearing. So the suffix vowels agree with the root vowels as they do in Turkish, but they follow another distinction, namely retracted, non-retracted. Most Transeurasian languages have vowel harmony, and most Transeurasian languages have retracted vowel harmony, except Japanese. In Japanese today, we have no vowel harmony. However, some people have proposed that in an ancient variety of Japanese, before Old Japanese, there was vowel harmony. And they think that because Old Japanese still has some residues of such a system. And these residues are known as Arisaka's law in Japanese. So in the 30s, Arisaka found that in Old Japanese, in the roots of the words in Old Japanese, uh, O, but schwa, or rounded O, wo, a, and u came together, and in other roots you find otu, so a kind of schwa-like sound together, and e is a neutral sound. So he found a kind of residue of an old system that could maybe be retracted versus non-retracted harmony in Japanese. So just to illustrate that, for instance, with a petrified marker, last time we spoke about Proto-Japonic ra, and we defined it as the manipulative verbalizer, and we found it in onomatopoeia, where it derived to sound or feel like the basic onomatopoeia. For instance, in pika pika, sparkling, we had pikaru, to shine, with this ra here in the end of the old Japanese word, hikaru in modern Japanese. Well, there are other onomatopoetic formations that seem to include this ra, like warao. Wa is probably the sound of laughing, wa wa wa, like we say ha ha ha. And ra is an onomatopoetic formant. And pi is like something like an iterative, say it many times. So you get warao, to laugh, with an a. But in other forms that also seem to be old, ancient onomatopoetic derivations, like noro in Japanese, you seem to have a no, a cursing onomatopoeia derived with a ro instead. So in many verbs you have this opposition between ra forms and ro forms, which may reflect an old um, distinction between retracted and non-retracted suffixes. So it could be that these are the vestiges of an old system that of vowel harmony that gradually collapsed in Japanese, and that is only preserved in a few old petrified forms. So Song Yong Ko has recently written a doctoral dissertation on the analysis of this tongue root vowel harmony across in Korean and other Transeurasian languages. And Whitman and Joseph here, there is in press, but in this has already appeared in 2020 in the Oxford Guide. They also follow this analysis of tongue root vowel harmony. So basically, they posit that most Transeurasian languages, Mongolic languages like Khalkha, Tungusic languages like Even, Korean, all have this opposition between retracted and non-retracted vowels. Whereas pre-Old Japanese, based on Arisaka's law, may have had it, but that is unsure. And then we also find it in languages in the neighborhood, like in Nifk and Proto-Yukagir may also have had it, like Japanese, that is not entirely sure. So if we then look at all the languages in the region, I here listed them like Turkish, Old Turkic, Khalkha, Middle Mongolian, Evenki, Manchu, Korean, Middle Korean, Japanese, Old Japanese, Khanti, Ket, Yukagir, Nifk, Ainu, Mandarin Chinese, and Rukai, then we can just indicate which of them have the feature of retracted tongue root harmony, so not in Turkish and not in Old Turkic, although there's vowel harmony, it's front back harmony and not retracted tongue root harmony. But then it is present in the other languages, not in present day Korean, but it is in Middle Korean, not in present day Japanese, but it can be reconstructed back to pre Old Japanese. Ganti and Ket don't have it, and then we see in Yukagir and Nifk have it. Ainu is insecure, and in Chinese and Rukai don't have it. So you can answer the feature with a yes or a no, a minus or a plus, and keep track of this feature. And that brings us to the second feature also discussed in the article, the absence of R in initial position. In Japanese, as you may have noticed, there are no native words that begin with an R. All words in Japanese that begin with an R are non-native, or that means that they have been borrowed from another language. Here I mentioned radio in Japanese, but there's also things like Rangaku, Dutch studies, or Rainen next year that begin with an R, but all those words have been borrowed from Chinese, so they are not native Japanese words. They are these words that consist of two characters, like combinations that have been borrowed. And the same is true for Korean, for Tungusic languages, for Khalkha and Turkish. The words there never begin with R except when they are borrowings. The languages in the neighborhood don't show this feature. So for Khalkha and Ket, Nifk, Ainu, Chinese, and Rukai, uh, all these languages can begin with an initial R. Only Yukagir shows the same feature. So that's also a feature that is shared between Japanese and the Transeurasian language, just but that is relatively absent in the surrounding languages. And then you have the third feature, which is the presence of a velar nasal, but not in initial position. So most Transeurasian languages have velar nasals that are sounds like ng. This sound here is the phonetic representation of such a ng. This ng is present in most Transeurasian languages, but at the same time, it cannot start a word, so it cannot occur in the beginning of a word. This is true for Turkish, Mongolian, uh, some Tungusic languages, but not the northern Tungusic languages like Evenki. We see in Evenki a velar nasal can start, so can begin a word, like in ngene, to go. But when we compare it to other words in Tungusic, like g in Manchu here, we can find out that it derived from an original Proto-Tungusic g followed by an N, R, L, M, or Y. In this case, it's followed by an N, and therefore it yields this nasalization here of the velar in Evenki. So this initial velar in some Tungusic languages is a secondary development. It has not been there always. Before, it wasn't there. So it's a minus in Evenki, but it is a plus for Manchu as an older source of Tungusic. Korean and Middle Korean is a plus. In Japanese, it's a minus because in modern Japanese there is no nasal velar phoneme, so it can also not occur word initially. In Old Japanese, however, one has been reconstructed on the basis of the voiced g. And here we have some languages in the neighborhood that have the features, and other don't. And then a fourth phonological feature is the presence of voicing distinction for stops. In Japanese, you have voiced sounds, so you have b, d, and g in Japanese. But interestingly, they almost never occur word initially. You find only very few words in Japanese with an initial voiced. And word medially, they can be derived from nasal clusters in Japanese. So if you have something like kagi, uh, uh, ki, then it is derived from an old Japanese form kanki. Uh, so with a voiceless K pre-nasalized. And that's also true for B from NP or D from NT or G from NK. So in Old Japanese and pre-Old Japanese, there was no voicing distinction, only voiceless and pre-nasalized. And also in Korean, you don't have that distinction today. In Korean, there is no voiced or voiceless distinction. There's only a distinction between lax, like in pul, fire, aspirated, like pul, grass, and then tense, like pul, horn. So there are three different distinctions, but there's no voiceless distinction. The typical Transeurasian distinction between voice and voiceless is only found in Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, not in Korean, in present day Japanese, but not in Old Japanese. And also in the languages of the neighborhood, most lack voicing distinction except for Ket, Yukagir, and Rukai. So these are a few phonological features that we examined. So things of the features of the sound system, properties of the sound system that Japanese has in common with other Trans-Eurasian languages. But there are also features of the lexical and the semantic structure that form parallels. The first feature that I would like to discuss is the preference for the nonverbal strategy of verbal borrowing. Wohlgemuth distinguished between two groups of languages when it came to verbal borrowing. You had those languages that borrowed a verb nakedly and inflected it, where the borrowed verb did not need any formal accommodation. And then you have those languages that use the nonverbal strategy. That is, they borrow the verb in a nonverbal form, in a nominal form, and they add a formal accommodation to the verb. For instance, if you have the English verb click, to click with a computer mouse, then Turkish will borrow that word as klik lemek, klik le. That shows that it is a borrowing. So the borrowing needs to be accommodated with an extra le before the verb can be inflected. Or a second strategy is to add a proverb, a light verb meaning to do or to make, and add it to the nominal form of the verb. So click etmek, to do click. Similarly, when, for instance, Galga, a Mongolian, here borrows the Mandarin verb zai to borrow, it also adds some formal accommodation. It adds a native suffix l to accommodate for the borrowing. And in Udehe and Tungusic language, when it borrows, for instance, a word like Russian tansevat, to dance, it will borrow the stem of the Russian verb tanseva, and it will add a la, which is a native suffix to accommodate for the borrowing. And similarly, also in Korean, when you want, for instance, to borrow the English verb to jog in Korean, you will go over the nominal verb form of the verb, jogging, and you will add hada. And hada is a verb like suru in Japanese, which means to do or to make. So you say something like to do jogging, jogging hada. And in the same way in Japanese, when Japanese borrows a verb from English, for instance, it goes over the nominal form of the verb jogging and it adds the light verb suru. So in all verbal borrowings, a formal accommodation needs to be added before the verb can be inflected. This is true for most Transeurasian languages, but not for the surrounding languages. For instance, in Mandarin, when it copies a verb from here, for instance, copier from French, it will borrow it here as KOB, and it will insert it as such in the sentence. It will not add an additional native accommodation for this verb. This is also true for Ainu. Moketa will be borrowed as such from Japanese, and there will be no native Ainu formant added. And also for the Northern Tungusic languages, Transeurasian languages, for instance, when Evenki borrows the Russian verb vypolnyat, it will borrow vypolnai, but not add the same marker la as was done here in Udehe. So the second category of verbs is the verbal strategy. That is, they borrow verbs as verbs without a formal accommodation. And as you can see, most Transeurasian languages here use the nonverbal strategy, while most surrounding languages use the verbal strategy. Another lexicosemantic feature are the demonstrative pronouns. When you studied Japanese, you probably discovered that there is a three-way distinction in the demonstratives in Japanese. You have a distinction between ko, like in kono, this, and so, sono, that. And then you have the distal form ano, that over there, or are, that over there, sore, that with you, and this proximal kore here. There's always this three-way distinction. And this was also such in Old Japanese, but for Old Japanese, it has been argued that the original distinction was between ko and ka. Remark again, ko and ka stand like in a kind of vowel harmony between retracted and non-retracted, and that so was added later to the system. So pre-Old Japanese probably had only a two-way distinction. In Korean today, we find a ik, jo, yogi, kogi, jogi, for instance, here, there, and over there distinction, again, a three-way distinction. In most Tungusic languages, we find a two-way distinction between this and that, like in Evenki, in Manchu. Also here in Khacha, Mongolian, we find a distinction between this and that. And then in Turkish today, we find a three-way distinction between bu, this, shu, that, and o, that over there. But in Old Turkic, again, we find a two-way distinction between this and that. And then in the neighboring languages, except for Khanti, where we find a two-way distinction, we find for most of the neighboring languages three-way distinctions, or even more than three distinction. Here in Mandarin, we also find a two-way distinction. So, in most of the Transeurasian languages, that is in Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic, we find this two-way distinction. In Korean and Japanese, we find a three-way distinction, just like we find in most of the neighboring languages. And then we go to the property words. With property words, I mean adjectives, words that express a property like new, old, high, hot, and so on. And property words across the Transeurasian languages can be verbally and nominally encoded and have traces of switched encoding. What I mean with that is that when you have a Japanese word like atsu, you can inflect that as a verb. How would you say? Uh, I don't know. Denise probably studied Japanese. How would you say it was hot, Denise, in Japanese?
Is it Atsukata desu?
Yes, very good. Atsukata or atsukata des. So it was hot. That means that you take the atsu and that you add an inflectional suffix kata. It hotted. It was hot. So you can inflect your adjective, which means that it is verbally encoded. There are other adjectives in Japanese like quiet. How would you say, for instance, Elias, a quiet person? Shizuka is quiet. Does somebody know how you say a quiet person in Japanese?
In Japanese, it's shizuka na hito.
Yeah, good. Shizuka na hito. Shizuka is like an adjective, a property word, but it is nominally encoded. So the little formant behind Shizuka comes from naru, which is verbal, so it is nominal per se. This Shizuka is a nominal adjective, while a word like Atsui is a verbal adjective. And there are even cases in Old Japanese, there were many such cases where one adjective, one property word can be both verbally and nominally encoding. For instance, in Old Japanese, you could say Takanaru Yama, a high mountain, with taka as a nominal adjective, but you could also say Yama ga takakata, to be high. The mountain was high. So you can both inflect it, uh, or it can be both nominally and verbally encoded, but for the same stem. In present day Japanese, there are only very few adjectives left that can still do that. Uh, can you, maybe somebody who studies Japanese, I think Daniela, do you study Japanese too? Can you think of a word in Japanese that can be both verbally and nominally encoding at the same time? There are only very few of such words.
I studied Japanese, but I actually don't know because it's quite a long time ago.
Yeah, I can understand, and it's also a tricky question. Does somebody has an idea about a word that you can inflect with na, but also can also be verbally inflected? That is e and na adjective at
Isn't
the
it?
same time. Yeah,
Um,
Katerina?
it's not an e adjective, but for byoki, it could be a verb and an adjective at the same time.
Byoki, yes, but byoki is a nominal form. So byoki nachto, you cannot really inflect byoki as a verb
Yeah.
unless you use it together with the copula. Byoki des, byoki deshita, byoki nachto. But for instance, e in Japanese, good, you can say yeah, yokata, for instance, it's inflected, uh, but you could. I think that e is a bad example. Oki, with oki you can do it. For instance, you can say oki, o, okikata, okikatayama or something. But you could also say okina mono, and a big thing. So you can inflect oki as a verb, and at the same time, you can also use it as a na adjective. That's a residue of this system whereby in the past, in Old Japanese, the same adjective could be used as a noun and as a verb. This is quite a remarkable feature that you do not find in many languages across the world. Especially this switched encoding is quite striking. And interestingly, it is found in all Transeurasian languages. So, for instance, in Korean, you have verbal adjectives like kutta, which you could uh, inflect like a verb to be or become hard. And you have also words like kanan, hada, be poor. But then in Middle Korean, you also have cases of switching, like between tussa, be warm, and tussa, hada, be warm. as a nominal encoding. In Tungusic, you have words like in Manchu akka, be sad, that can be inflected like a verb, but then you have also den, haitol, that is just nominal. And then you also again have switched encodings like jalu full and jalu be full, that can be both. And in Mongolic, for instance, written Mongolian has chala, be warm. Um, as a nominal adjective, you have, for instance, kara, black, but there are also words like bulka, hostile, that can have both the nominal and the verbal encoding. And also in Turkic, you find words like kat, be hard, that is inflected like a verb, isik, hot, that is a noun, but also words like ach, that can mean both hungry and to be hungry at the same time. So that can be nominally and verbally encoded at the same time. So what we see is that in most Transeurasian languages, we find at least traces of switched encoding. This switched encoding is especially present in the older stages of the language, like in Old Turkic, Middle Mongolian, Manchu, Middle Korean, and Old Japanese. But as we said, there are also residues like Oki, Okina in contemporary Japanese and contemporary Transeurasian languages. In most of the surrounding languages, however, or in all surrounding languages, this feature is absent. So it is also a feature that really defines the Transeurasian languages as a structural type that delimits them from neighboring languages in the area. And that brings us from lexical structure to morphological structure. As we already noted or noticed, the Japanese morphology is predominantly suffixing. Maybe somebody, Julia Leidig, maybe can give us an example of a suffix string in Japanese, like an example where you use a suffix, for instance, attached to a Japanese verb. Uh,
Oh, sorry, I don't speak Japanese.
oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's all right. I was just,
Most people do, so I supposed. Um, Katarina, maybe you can help us out. Can you give an example of a verb form in Japanese, a stem plus a suffix or more suffixes?
That's kind of difficult.
Okay. Uh,
I don't know how.
an inflected verb, for instance, anything we do. Elias, can you give an example?
You could add rare to make it a potential form, for example.
Exactly. As we tatsu tatareru, for instance, we can stand or it stands up. That would be possible. So you can add suffixes to verbs. Also, the mashta, for instance, that taberu tabemashta. This form polite plus past is also an example of a suffix. Almost all inflections you form in Japanese are suffixing. There are hardly any prefixes in Japanese. Does somebody has an example of a prefix in Japanese, something that you add in front of the word rather than in the end of the word? There are only very, very few.
Isn't it an O for osushi to
Yeah,
make it
yeah,
more
that's a
polite?
good example. That's a nice example indeed. The honorific prefixes like osushi or odenwa or something is an example, and that's also something that developed later in the course of Japanese. So that was not there all the way in old Japanese. For instance, these prefixes are not so common. Another thing, for instance, with colors, you have ma'ao. For instance, ao is blue and ma'ao is completely blue, or masao also, or all red. But it's mostly small derivational prefixes. Most of the morphology in Japanese is suffixing, and that is also true for all other Transeurasian languages. So these languages are predominantly suffixing. For languages in the area, that's not always the case. For instance, ket here is prefixing for its nouns and suffixing for its verbs. Nifk is prefixing and only very little suffixing, so the opposite of Japanese. Ainu can be both prefixing and suffixing. Mandarin can be lightly suffixing, but is mainly an isolating language. And then Rukai uses prefixes and suffixes. So, what brings all these Transeurasian languages together is that they are predominantly suffixing. The imperative in most Transeurasian languages is also expressed by a bare verb stem, so an uninflected verb stem. For instance, in Turkish, you say come here, gel, which is the stem of the verb. Also in Turkish, gel, kom. Middle Mongolian, ire, in Khalkha, ir, kom. Manchu, gene, go. Old Japanese, you would have mi, look, whereas today you would rather say miro or mite kudasai for look. Ainu has a nu, listen, also a bare verb stem. In most of the surrounding languages and in some contemporary stages of Transeurasian languages, you find imperatives expressed with suffixes. Like in Evenki, you will take the stem eme of coming and then kel, eme kel, kom. Or in Korean, you will have mok, the stem, and o, eat, for eat. Although this o is originally a bare form of a copula, but still in Korean, contemporary Korean, you use this suffix miro with the suffix. Also in Khantian and the other surrounding languages, you will always use suffixes. So this is again something that brings the Transeurasian languages together, at least in their historical stages. There we see that the imperative was also always expressed with a bare verb stem, whereas in the neighboring languages we mostly find suffixes except for Ainu and Chinese. And then obligatory numeral classifiers. We often think of Japanese as a language that uses obligatory classifiers, and that is also so for contemporary Japanese. So if you say things like impitsu sambon, you must use a classifier there. The classifier is this word bon that shows the characteristics of what you count. So this bon is used for long cylindrical things. When you count long cylindrical things, you will always add hon or bon or pon. As here in Empitsu Sambon. And in contemporary Japanese, that's obligatory. However, in old Japanese, we still see a system without classifiers. So there we see nana se, 7 rapids. There's no classifier because the system with classifiers came in only later in Middle Japanese and later under influence of Chinese. In Korean, contemporary Korean, we often see classifiers today. So you have, for instance, put, sok, charu. Put is writing brush. Sok is here. Se means tree. So this se is the number 3, and the charu is a classifier also for these long, small things like bon or pon or hon in Japanese. So 3 writing brushes. But in more petrified expressions in Korean, like tunara, they still use the two without a classifier, two countries. And also in Middle Korean, we see that the system was not to use any classifier. So you had tukal, two knives. So basically, these classifiers came in rather late in the history of the language under Chinese influence. The Tungusic languages do not use classifiers except for Manchu. As we said, Manchu was a language that has been heavily under Chinese influence, as it was the ruling language of one of the Chinese dynasties. And there, for instance, we find Ilan tree, Fesin, the classifier, and then Loho, sword, for tree sword. So again, with the Fesin classifier, the idea of the concept of classifiers being borrowed from Chinese. However, this Fesin is not obligatory in Manchu, as you can also use Loho, Ilan, tree swords without the classifier. So across the Transeurasian languages, we see that the use of classifiers is non-obligatory, except for contemporary Japanese, where it is obligatory. In some of the neighboring languages, there are no classifiers, and in others, there are obligatory classifiers, like in Nifk, Ainu, and Chinese. Then we can have a look at the personal pronouns, and especially at at the nasal oblique stem of personal pronouns. So, in for instance, here the nominative first singular. In many Transeurasian languages, you have in the nominative pronoun without n, and in the oblique cases, in the non-nominative cases, in the other cases, you add an n. In Old Turkic, that is not so clear because you have an n both in the nominative as in the oblique. But in all other Transeurasian languages, you see things like in Khalkha Mongolian, you see b, and in the oblique, you see bidden here with an n. Um, or Middle Mongolian b and man, again with an n in the oblique. In Evenki, b and min, again this n, and so on. In Old Japanese, you have also some residue of such a system where you have wa as the first singular. That's the same form that you find in ware today, or in watashi. So this wa was used for the first singular I, but if you used some oblique forms, like for instance in the dative in Old Japanese was ni, like it is today, like you would say watashi ni, but instead of saying wa ni, you added a nu, wa nu ni. So it looks as if we have also traces of this nasal oblique form in the pronouns. Also in the Ryukyuan dialects, you see a similar thing where you have wa, for instance, in shuri for the nominative first singular, but in all other cases of the first singular pronoun, you add an n. In most Transeurasian languages, so you add an n in the oblique stem of personal pronouns. In the neighboring languages, this is only due for Khanty. Here you have me and men. In Rukai, there's also an oblique form of the pronoun, like here you have the nominative first singular rao, and another oblique form, yai. But as you can see, there's no n involved here. So the feature of the extra n in the oblique pronouns goes for all Transeurasian languages and Khanty, and does not hold for the neighboring languages. And then now we have had phonology, sound, we discussed lexicon, and then morphology. Fourth and last, we will have a look at the syntactic structure. In as we already remarked, Japanese and also other Transeurasian languages are dependent marking, and they're not only dependent marking in the noun phrase, they are also dependent marking in the clause. Basically, this means that all markers, markers for verb agreement or for a case agreement are marked on the dependent and not on the head. So on the verb, you will, for instance, here in Japanese, on the verb you find very little marking. The only marking is a non-past, and all the agreement, for instance, is marked on the constituents. All the agreement is marked on the dependents, and only few agreement is marked on the verb. That means that Japanese is dependent marking in the clause. We have this in the sentence Yamada sensei ni tegami o miseru. She shows the letter to Professor Yamada. But you have it also in Korean. Haraboji ke tonul turiosoyo. She gave her grandfather some money. Here there is a little bit of marking on the verb, but for instance, no person agreement. So no verb person agreement on the verb. In Mongolian too, there's no verb person agreement on the verb at all, and all cases, accusative, dative, are all marked on the constituents. In Turkish and Tungusic, there's a little bit of person agreement on the verb. For instance, here first singular is marked on the verb, and here a third singular is marked on the verb in Evenki, but altogether there's very few verb agreement, and the case marking is all marked on the constituents. So all these languages share a very similar structure where case and where case is marked on the dependent and where there's not so much agreement on the verb. The same is true for the possessive noun phrase. We already discussed that, saying, for instance, that Turkish is double marking. The genitive here in the door of the room is marked on both the room and the door. Uh, um, the door of the room thereof, so you have it double. While in most Transeurasian languages, possessive marking is dependent marking. You mark it on the dependent and not on the head, so always on the possessor. Like in Chalcha mini esh, my mother, the genitive is on the my, or in amai bo, father's house, the genitive is on the father. Nai yompil, my pencil, the genitive is on the na. I anata no atama, the genitive is on the anata. And this is also true for Yukagir and Mandarin, but all other languages in the area, the non-Trans-Eurasian languages in the area, are all head marking, as you can see. So that means that they mark the possessive on the main word on the head. Extensive use of converbs is also a Trans-Eurasian feature. Converbs are non-finite forms of the verb that are used for adverbial subordination. In Japanese uses many converbs, like the te converb in tabette. For instance, in taro ga bangohan no tabette furo ni haita. Taro ate dinner and went to the bath or took a bath. Uh, so these specific converb forms are also very typical for other Trans-Eurasian languages. You have, for instance, this ko in Korean, kihonen nol go chasoyo, kiho played and then slept. Or here in Evan, the mi converb, dagam mi kuntele duf ichitin. When he came nearer, he saw a house on a clearing, and here also in Chach and Mongolian, gere se garat, and then the whole sentence. So in this garat, the converb form, and here the inche in Turkish. So these are all these typical converb forms. In other surrounding languages, you do not use such converbs forms. Some languages, like Chinese, use mere juxtaposition, so they put just the sentences in a row, and other languages use other strategies, but these converbs are very typical for the Transeurasian languages. Another thing is how language express I have, so possession. In Japanese, you can express possession through the use of a locative or a dative suffix, watashi ni, to me, and an existential verb, aru, exist. To me exists a book. So watashi ni hon ga aru. I have a book is expressed by there is a book to me, or there exists a book to me. And in the same way, other languages like Korean do that. Nahante jegi ita. To me, there is a book. Or in Manchu, minde. To me, bite be. A book there is. Or mindu. To me, in Evenki, kniga, borrowing from Russian, bisin, there is. Or in Gaga Nadet nom ben. To me, there is a book. And also here, bende bir kitab var. To me, one book there is. So this predicative possession can be encoded by locative existential constructions throughout the Transeurasian languages. And for most neighboring languages, this is not possible except in Ket, Nifk, and Rukai. And also the use of the ablative case form for comparison is something typical for the Transeurasian languages. For instance, in Japanese, we will use an ablative form for comparison, like in Chikyu, which is the world, the globe. Chikyu yori omoi, heavier than the globe. So this yori is an ablative form which you use for comparison. Um, in literary Korean, this is also possible with eso, I eso, token sarang, a greater love than this. Here too, you use an ablative suffix or case marker. In Manchu, you do the same. Erenial ma chisen, better than this person, with here the ablative. Or in Evenki, oronduk gugdat mar, taller than a deer. This Duk is an ablative marker, and also in Khalkha Mongolian, Ene Hunes Ilu, better than this person, this S is ablative. And in Turkish, you have Bu Arabadan Daha Büyük, bigger than this car. So the same construction is used throughout to express comparison. In surrounding languages, this is usually not done with this strategy except for Ket and Yukagir. And then we can put all the features together. So as you see, I here made a table listing all the languages we mentioned today, all the languages of our study, the Transeurasian languages from Turkic to Japanese, and then the non-Transeurasian language, the neighboring languages from Khanty to Rukai. Uh, I listed all the features we discussed today. Actually, we discussed today only 16 features, but in the article there were some more, as we said, relating to grammaticalization, and I added those too. For each negative, for each absent feature, I marked a minus, and for each presence of a feature, I marked a plus. And like that, I summarized the presence and absence of all the features we discussed today. And in this row, I added all the pluses, so I just counted the pluses. And in this row, I counted the percentage of pluses. So what we can see is that from Turkish to Japanese, the percentages are quite high. So it looks as if from Turkish to Japanese we find a certain structural coherence. Especially in the older stages of the languages, we find percentages of 90, 59, 100%. So all the features are well represented. While in the neighboring languages, from Kanti to Rukai here, the features are very underrepresented, so to say. So it is clear that the features, the 20 features that we discussed today, kind of delimit the Transeurasian languages vis-a-vis the other languages in the neighborhood. So they are typical for Japanese and the other Transeurasian languages, but not for neighboring languages in the area. We also see that for some languages it is possible, for some features it is possible to get an idea about how frequent they occur in the languages of the world. Basically, I did that using this book. Maybe you know it, the World Atlas of Language Structure. You can also access it online and it gives you nice maps. You can also generate maps on the basis of a data set of about 500 languages and different structural features. And based on walls, basically, uh, I generated these percentages for the frequencies. So you see that most features are present in less than half of the languages worldwide. So we cannot say that the fact that they are shared from Turkish to Japanese is merely a universal feature, because they're not so common cross-linguistically or universally. But then, if it's not universals, what is it? Why do the Trans-Eurasian languages share these abstract features, and why can do they form a delimited group vis-a-vis their neighbors? And I think that, of course, one of the explanations might be borrowing, and that is also the most common idea across linguists, that when you see mere features shared between languages, the chance that these features have diffused is quite high. So borrowing is an explanation that is very often used for features shared between languages. Um, Borrowing in the sense of convergence over time or areality. But I think that not all features that we discussed today can be merely explained by borrowing. And my idea is that some of the features probably go back to a common heritage, to the common ancestral language that already had the feature, and just the feature was just inherited in the daughter languages. The reason why I think that is for a few reasons that I list here. And the first reason is that when we look at the historical pattern of the features, we see a decrease of typological similarity over time and not an increase over time. When features are borrowed, you expect that over time languages converge more and more. But in the case of the Trans-Eurasian features, you see exactly the opposite. You see that the oldest Trans-Eurasian languages share the features, but over time, the contemporary languages decrease the number of features. They have less and less features in common. When we look, for instance, at the features, we see a structural coherence uh, of 70% in contemporary Turkish, but 90% in Old Turkic, and 95% in contemporary Mongolian, but 100% in Middle Mongolian, 75% in contemporary Tungusic, but 100% uh, more older stages of Tungusic, and 56% in contemporary Korean, 75 in Middle Korean, and 60 in Japanese, but 95% in Old Japanese. So here we clearly see that the typological similarity decreases over time. And according to me, that is a argument against borrowing, because in the case of borrowing, you would expect that it increases over time and that the languages converge more and more over time. Another argument is the geography. Namely, we see the absence of features in spite of geographical proximity and the sharing of features in spite of geographical isolation. What I mean by this is when you look at Japanese, you see that Japanese, and especially old Japanese, shares a lot of features with the Transeurasian languages. And yet Japanese is an isolated language in the sense that it is spoken on the Japanese islands, and that throughout its history it had very few contacts with the surrounding neighboring languages on the continent. And still, it resembles the Trans-Eurasian languages much more than other languages on the continent, other languages in the neighborhood that are in much greater contact with Trans-Eurasian languages like Khanty and Yukagir or Nifk and Chinese. In these neighboring languages, the typological coherence is very low, although they are geographically very near to the Trans-Eurasian languages. This also argues against borrowing, against diffusion of the features, and it supports inheritance of the features. The distribution is another argument, namely that you find structural uniformity in Korean that is lower than in Japanese. So here you see a 75% structural coherence in Korean, while in Japanese, in Old Japanese, you had 95%. In a borrowing scenario, you would expect that the features go from one language into the other gradually. So they would start, say, in Mongolian, go into Tungusic, go into Korean, go into Japanese. So the languages at the end at the periphery of the continuum would have the lowest similarity. And that is not what we see. We see a higher similarity at the edges than more in the center of our language continuum, which also speaks against borrowing. And then finally, another argument that can be made against borrowing is that we see structural parallels, like yes, no features shared between these languages, but in addition, we also see formal correspondences uh, of the markers reflecting these features. Think of the N. The N was the marker, the oblique marker in the personal pronoun paradigm. We find not only a correspondence between oblique forms, between the use of oblique forms across the Trans-Eurasian languages, but we also find that the very oblique marker is a nasal N. So that also strengthens the idea of typological inheritance. That brings us to the argument of many linguists. Many linguists think that the typological features that we discussed today need to be seen within a larger Northern Eurasian macro area, and that this macro area consists of the Uralic languages here in light blue, and then the Trans-Eurasian languages in blue, and that all these languages share certain features by mere diffusion, by mere borrowing, not by inheritance. Nichols, for instance, notes that over time, the families of Northern Eurasia have come to resemble each other more and more in structural typology, culminating in the Eurasian or Altaic linguistic type and a high degree of structural consistency. So she says these features are borrowed because over time the languages come to resemble each other more and more, they converge. And Jan Hoenen has a similar argument. He says speaking of Altaic instead of Uralic is a misconception, for there are no areal or typological features that are specific only to Altaic without Uralic. There's nothing in Altaic that is not equally true of Uralic. So his argument is that every shared similarity that we find across the Trans-Eurasian languages will also be found in the group of Uralic languages, and that shows that it's not genealogically motivated, but that it is borrowed. However, I think that both arguments can be easily countered. We actually showed today that the arguments are not entirely valid, because today we showed that over time the Trans-Eurasian languages have come to resemble each other less and less in certain typological features. We see that old Japanese is more structurally coherent with Trans-Eurasian than contemporary Japanese. So, unlike Joanna Nichols' idea that the languages come to resemble each other more and more, we find that for certain features, the languages come to resemble each other less and less. They diverge instead of converging. And then the Jan Hoenen argument, Jan Hoenen, that says that it's not possible to delimit the Trans-Eurasian type from the Uralic type, that all features you find in Trans-Eurasian will be automatically found in Uralic. This can also be countered because of many of the features we discussed today. For instance, the tongue root harmony in Trans-Eurasian is not present in Uralic, because in Uralic it's palatal harmony. The voicing distinction in Trans-Eurasian is another distinction, singleton geminate in Uralic. The nonverbal strategy for verbal copying in Trans-Eurasian is a verbal strategy of direct insertion in Uralic. The mixed switch encoding of properties in Trans-Eurasian is nominal coding in Uralic. The imperatives as bare verb stems in Trans-Eurasian is imperatives with second person suffixes in Uralic.